A woman named Darlene is in a car with her boyfriend Mike when a stranger walks up and opens fire. Shockingly, the shooter later calls the police himself to report it. When officers arrive, they find Mike barely alive. Later, Robert, a cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle, shows up at the office to submit his latest work. During a meeting, Templeton's secretary hands him a letter signed anonymously. The writer claims responsibility for Darlene's murder and another shooting, enclosing a cryptic cipher and demanding it be published on the front page, or more people will die. The newsroom erupts into chaos. Senior journalist Paul contacts authorities, who confirm the details in the letter are real. The paper decides to print the letter, but only on page 4. Paul believes the killer hid his name in the code, while Robert disagrees, thinking the Zodiac wouldn't give away his identity. Soon after, a schoolteacher named Betty cracks the cipher and reaches out to the Chronicle. When the decoded message arrives, Paul questions Robert's earlier theory. Robert doesn't answer. He simply reads it aloud. The killer gleefully describes murdering as a game, even claiming humans are the most dangerous animals on Earth. The quote strikes Robert as familiar, but he can't quite place it. Then, a new letter arrives. This time, the killer signs off with a name, the Zodiac, along with a unique symbol. Roughly a month later, a couple relaxing in a park is attacked and stabbed by a masked figure, who again calls police to report the crime. The next day at work, Robert remembers the quote. It's from The Most Dangerous Game, a film about a man who hunts humans for sport. Not long after, the Zodiac strikes again, killing a taxi driver named Stein in another part of town. Nearby children witness the crime and call the police, believing it was a robbery. Detectives Dave and William arrive and discover the killer left behind gloves. Witnesses say he wiped down the driver's side before fleeing. The next day, the Chronicle receives another letter, this time with a piece of Stein's blood-stained shirt. The Zodiac admits to the killing and threatens to attack a school bus. Dave and William visit the newspaper to examine the letter. Disturbed by the threat, Dave tells Paul not to mention the danger to kids in print. Later, a handwriting expert confirms it's from the same killer. Only then does Dave authorize its release to the public. Meanwhile, Robert grows increasingly obsessed. He tells Paul he believes Stein's murder was the Zodiac breaking his usual pattern of targeting couples. Elsewhere, William contacts police from other cities where the Zodiac claimed victims. He learns the shoe prints at Darlene's crime scene resemble military-issued footwear. He also checks on Mike, only to find the surviving victim has left town. That night, Dave gets another alert. The Zodiac has made a phone call, saying he wants to speak with radio host Melvin. Dave and William brief Melvin and coach him to keep the killer talking and push for a face-to-face. Eventually, the Zodiac calls into the show. When asked his name, he says Sam. Melvin keeps him talking, gently asking if he needs help. The caller admits to having constant headaches. Melvin suggests seeing his chiropractor, but the call ends abruptly. Realizing the Zodiac may have suspected the call was being tracked, Melvin publicly reassures listeners that no tracing was involved. Shortly after, the Zodiac calls again, claiming he kills people to relieve his headaches. Melvin asks to meet, and the Zodiac agrees, on the condition that he chooses the location. But when the appointed time arrives, the Zodiac doesn't show. Upon investigating the phone calls, law enforcement determines that the second one came from a mental institution and was just a hoax. Days later, the Zodiac sends a letter saying he will no longer announce his murders and is now building a bomb to store in his basement for future use. This leaves William and Dave at a loss, especially since basements are uncommon in their region. Meanwhile, Paul and Robert meet at a bar to discuss the latest letter. Paul questions Robert's obsession with the case, and Robert admits he's fascinated by puzzles and codes. Soon after, Melvin receives a new letter from the Zodiac, who says he's contemplating another killing spree and needs help. Melvin tells William and Dave that the killer has attempted to call him multiple times, but his maid always answers and says he's not available. A few weeks pass, and the Zodiac reemerges by offering a ride to a stranded woman and her infant. Once in the car, he threatens to kill her and toss the baby out the window. Fortunately, she escapes before he acts. In the following letters, the Zodiac confirms the attempted attack and takes credit for additional murders. But despite this, the Chronicle decides to stop publishing his messages. While discussing this with Robert, Paul says the decision might be smart. It's possible the Zodiac hasn't killed anyone since the Stein case. He shows Robert how the Zodiac now only sends letters after the crimes are already public, unlike before. Paul also theorizes that the name Zodiac may have come from a watch brand with the same name and symbol. Months later, Paul receives a chilling letter, this time with a blood-stained scrap of Stein's shirt attached. Enraged and frightened, Paul suspects he's become a target. Dave believes this is a consequence of something Paul wrote that offended the Zodiac. Paul asks for a gun for self-defense, which he eventually gets. While practicing at a shooting range, he tells Robert he has an upcoming meeting in Riverside with an anonymous source who claims to have info on the Zodiac. Paul asks Robert to join him, but Robert declines because he has a date with a woman named Melanie. Later, Robert arrives late to the date and explains the situation to Melanie, including where Paul went. Concerned that Paul might have walked into a trap, Melanie suggests the anonymous contact could be the Zodiac himself. Alarmed, Robert calls Paul's wife to check in, but she hasn't heard from him. He and Melanie go home to wait for a call. Eventually, Paul phones and says he's made a major discovery. He soon goes public with a report about a Riverside murder that might be linked to the Zodiac. Dave and William are stunned, as Paul never shared this info with them. They immediately travel to Riverside to follow up and discover that the killer in that case also sent a letter confessing to the crime. Soon after, they receive a tip from a man named Genie, who claims to know the Zodiac's real identity. He says his old friend Lee once talked about going on a killing spree and sending letters to police under the name Zodiac. When Genie objected to the name, Lee became defensive, but insisted he would proceed. Genie says he told police back when the killings began, but they didn't take him seriously. With new momentum, Dave and William are cleared to locate and question Leigh. Along with Sergeant Mulanax, they sit down with him. Leigh denies ever discussing anything related to the Zodiac and mentions he was interrogated after the first murder because a neighbor saw him with bloody knives. That neighbor later died from a heart attack. As the conversation continues, the investigators notice that Leigh is wearing military-style shoes and a Zodiac brand watch. Leigh says the watch was a birthday gift from his mother. When the questions intensify, Leigh declares that he isn't the Zodiac, and even if he were, he wouldn't admit it. Eventually, he recalls telling a man named Phil that his favorite book is The Most Dangerous Game. After he leaves, Dave becomes convinced Leigh is the prime suspect. They track down Leigh's brother, who says Leigh has a history of mental illness. His sister-in-law recalls that the Zodiac once misspelled Christmas the same way Leigh did in a letter to them. Despite all this, the police are denied a search warrant due to a lack of evidence. Nearly a year later, Dave finally gets a warrant after learning Leigh is now living in a trailer. When they search it, they find 3 guns, gloves, and shoes similar to the ones connected to the Zodiac. Leigh returns home during the search but stays silent. Days later, the team is disappointed to learn that none of the evidence, including handwriting samples, matches the Zodiac's. Years pass. One day, while going through old Zodiac materials, Robert gets the idea to write a book about the case. He pitches it to Paul, who declines, having lost his job after writing to the police demanding control of the investigation. Undeterred, Robert begins his own research. He reconnects with Dave, hoping for help, but Dave brushes him off, saying the case has been cold for years. He eventually directs Robert to someone named Ken, who sends him to Mullinax for access to Darlene's case files. Robert discovers that Darlene had a mysterious admirer who once attended a painting party at her house, which had made her uneasy. He also learns that just before her family found out about her death, someone phoned her relatives and said nothing, just heavy breathing. This points to someone who knew her. Since Mike remains missing, Robert decides to find Darlene's sister, Linda. He seeks Dave's assistance, who then tells him about Melvin's maid, the woman who spoke directly to the Zodiac during one of the calls. Robert visits Melvin's home, and while waiting, the maid guesses his reason for visiting. She confirms she once spoke to the Zodiac, who told her he needed to kill someone because it was his birthday. Using this, Robert deduces the Zodiac's birthday is likely December 18. He shares this with Dave, who sends him to speak with someone named Mel to verify the story. Mel dismisses the birthday detail as irrelevant, adding that none of the suspects were born on that date. Still, Robert thinks it might be the only clue the Zodiac slipped on. Mel advises Robert to focus on the solid evidence instead. Motivated, Robert sets up an appointment with Sherwood to compare handwriting samples. When he returns home, Melanie tells him that Sherwood called back, but she's clearly upset. She says that Robert's Zodiac research has made the papers, which could put them in danger. Back home, Robert receives a strange, silent phone call with only breathing on the line. Disturbed, he visits Ken to ask about Rick. Ken reveals Rick was his top suspect for a while. He recalls Rick obsessing over wiping his fingerprints after receiving a photo. Ken suggests they obtain Rick's handwriting for comparison. Robert contacts Sherwood for Penny's info. Penny initially refuses but eventually sends an old theater poster Rick wrote on. Sherwood finds the handwriting eerily similar and asks for more samples, saying it's the closest match he's seen. Soon after, Dave gets word of a new Zodiac letter. This one mentions him by name. But at the station, things flip. He's accused of faking the letter for attention. The next day, Robert asks Dave for help finding Linda to verify the handwriting. Dave refuses, bitter over the ordeal, and says Sherwood's credibility is gone. He's now an alcoholic who was fired. Undeterred, Robert and Ken search for Linda and discover she's in jail. Robert's excitement shows, prompting Melanie to ask what he's really after. He says he just wants to catch the killer, but Melanie, shaken, reveals someone's been calling their house every night. Robert brushes it off and says he needs to see Bob. At a restaurant, Robert meets Bob, and they continue the conversation at Bob's house. When Rick comes up, Bob asks if it's about the film canisters. As they talk, Robert mentions posters Rick supposedly wrote. Bob then casually reveals he wrote them himself, sending a chill down Robert's spine. It gets creepier when Bob invites him to the basement. Anxious, Robert finds an excuse to leave. When he gets home, he finds Melanie has packed up the kids and left. The next day, Robert visits Linda in prison. He asks about Darlene's strange friend from a painting party. Linda says Darlene feared him and warned others to stay away. She pauses, then recalls his name, Leigh. Robert rushes to Mullinax and digs through the files, discovering Linda had mentioned Leigh before. But Mullinax dismisses it. Leigh was already cleared. Frustrated, Robert goes home. That night, another breathing-only phone call comes in. Shortly after, Melanie returns briefly. She says she can't take it anymore and leaves again, after handing Robert an envelope, asking him to finish what he started so they can come back. Inside is Leigh's ID, showing he was born on December 18th. Alarmed, Robert heads to Dave's house late at night. Dave threatens to call the police until Robert mentions Leigh's name. Robert insists Leigh is the Zodiac and shows him the ID. Dave recalls Leigh being the only suspect to ever reach out, sending a typed letter offering help. He also reveals Leigh spent time in jail, coinciding with when the Zodiac letters stopped. The next morning, they talk privately. Robert lays out everything pointing to Lee. Dave is unsure. There could be other people with that name. But Robert shares one last detail. Lee lived in his grandmother's basement, near where Darlene worked. Dave finally sees the connection. Lee and Darlene knew each other. Before parting, Dave urges Robert to finish his book and thanks him for helping close a chapter that haunted him for years. Later, Robert visits a hardware store where Lee works. He just stares. Lee notices and grows uneasy. Robert walks away. 7.5 years later, Mike agrees to come forward. Detective George arranges a meeting. As Mike heads there, Robert's book, now a bestseller, is on display at a local shop. At the meeting, George shows Mike a photo lineup. Mike studies it, then points to Lee as the man who shot him. When asked to rate his confidence, he replies, 8. The movie ends.